Good afternoon, good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give everyone just a couple of minutes to get into the Zoom room before we get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so. I still see a number of people joining. So we're going to give everyone just a moment to get settled here before we dive in. This is a popular topic. We still have a lot of people joining, so we're going to give it just one more minute before we dive in here. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad that you've joined us for this installment of the Joyce Foundation's Lunch and Learn webinar series entitled Emerging Research into Concealed Carry Licensing. My name is Luisa Aviles. I'm a Senior Program Officer in the Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. For those of you who are a regular on these webinars, please forgive me. I don't have the usual Joyce Foundation background. We're having a little bit of technical issues, but we think we've worked most of them out. So thanks for bearing with us. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Daniel Webster, the Bloomberg Professor of American Health at Johns Hopkins University, and Kash Prafasi, the Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Gun Violence Solutions, also at Johns Hopkins. Before we get started this morning, a bit of quick housekeeping. First, today's webinar is being recorded, and in the coming days will be made available on the Joyce Foundation's website. Second, we expect to have at least 20 minutes for question and answer, and we encourage you to drop questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen as they come to you, even if the presenters are still speaking. That way we won't interrupt their flow, but we'll have your questions ready when we get to the Q&A section. And finally, after today's discussion, we'll share key materials, including a copy of the PowerPoint deck referenced in today's webinar. So before I hand things over to Dr. Prafasi, I wanted to take a moment and share a very little bit of background just to make sure we're all starting from the same place. So the current legal landscape regarding state concealed carry gun laws is changing really quickly. In 2022, the US Supreme Court ruled in Bruen versus New York State Pistol and Rifle Association that New York's law requiring a proper cause or special need to get a concealed carry permit was unconstitutional. Following that decision, policymakers in several states have reconsidered firearms carrying laws, with some removing permit requirements altogether. So during this webinar, Professors Webster and Prafasi will discuss two new research studies about this changing policy landscape. The first was recently published in the American Journal of Epidemiology and explores the effects of states moving from may issue to shall issue concealed carry permit laws. And the second, which was recently published in the Criminology and Public Policy Journal, further explores the effect of states moving from a shall issue to a permitless concealed carry state. So with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Prafasi.
Thanks, Luisa. Really excited to be with everyone today to hear about some of the new work that we're doing. So welcome. It's great to have everybody here. I wanted to spend just a minute or two talking about some of the motivation for this work. So a lot of attention has been centered around the Bruen decision in 2022, but our center has been thinking about this and been a thought leader in the space since around 2017, 2018. Some other researchers, John Donahue, had been in this space as well. But we really wanted to think about what might happen if we lost the ability to have discretion, the ability to require someone to have that good and substantial reason. And instead, what are some objective criteria that we might use? And Daniel, Dr. Webster, in just a moment will come join us and talk about that. But we were hearing from advocates, from policymakers, concerns around the direction some of these policies were heading. I also personally had participated in many concealed carry courses and was concerned around the very disparate ways that these courses were run, the different criteria that were required in order to be able to get a license. And so Daniel's going to talk through some of our recent work. After he's talked about those research findings, I'll jump back in and share a little bit of public opinion data about what are the public's thoughts about some of these topics that Daniel's going to talk about, and then lots of time for Q&A. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Daniel.
Thanks, Cass. And thanks, Louisa, for kind of teeing this up. I'm going to be sharing some research. I'm really honored to share it, but I'm just one team member here. Mitch Doucette has led these studies and gets 98% of the credit, perhaps. Alex McCord, also a great contributor to this, and Cass as well. Can I go to the next slide, please? Thanks. South Carolina just became the 29th state to go to a totally permitless, no requirement to get a license to carry concealed firearms in most public places. The set of changes has been very rapid in recent years. I also just sort of note, and it's almost seems surreal, but 40 years ago in the United States, it was mostly no issue for concealed carry or highly discretionary issuance of licenses to carry concealed firearms, even in states that now are totally permitless. Some of the changes happened gradually over time, but they've accelerated greatly after the Bruen decision in 2022. Other thing of note, just in the background here, we particularly in 2020, there was an enormous increase in purchases of handguns in the United States, as seemed like everything was coming apart in our society, and particularly faith in police and government. Next slide, please. So the two research studies, I think, connect to a common general framework for thinking about how concealed carry laws might impact both fatal and non-fatal forms of violent crime. This is actually probably the most researched type of firearm policy, perhaps because there have been so many changes to study. And it's also been one that's easy, that just simply has a lot of public attention. So in our conceptualization of this, that these laws that make it easier to for civilians to carry concealed firearms, there's simply more guns in more spaces that and a variety of things can happen with them. Of course, there could be more available for defensive use, but they're also more vulnerable to theft. And perhaps being in more public spaces with guns, minor altercations may spiral into something far more serious with more people with guns. The shooting at the Super Bowl parade in Kansas City was sort of a very interesting, tragic example of this. Missouri is a permitless carry place. A lot of people with guns in a very crowded place. And from my reading of that, the mere presence of those guns were really key to making that act of violence occur. And lots of people were not there using their guns to stop it. Okay, next slide. As I mentioned, there's a long history of research in this, most infamously research led by John Lott, who published a book based upon that research called More Guns, Less Crime. This got great scrutiny in the field, and in 2005, National Research Council did a critical review and found a lot of big problems with those data. They were very sensitive to minor changes in the models. Reductions don't hold when more years were included. And any reductions that were apparent in any of the models occurred many, many, many years after the laws went into place. Next slide, please. Many of you probably are familiar with the work that RAND has done to summarize research and sort of evaluate what the evidence is around different policies. I'm just sharing this with you now of key findings for shall issue concealed carry laws. They find evidence supportive that these lead to increases in homicides. And as far as permitless, there's uncertainty. This review was published in January of 2023. Next slide. While there have been a lot of studies, at least for my money, some of the most influential work has been done by John Donohue at Stanford and other colleagues that he's published with. And I'll highlight a couple of papers, a couple of studies, one using principally synthetic control methods that I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, and found that these shall issue laws or right to carry laws were associated with 13 to 15% increase in violent crime over a 10-year period, with sort of a gradual effect increasing violence over time. And then there's also National Bureau of Economic Research working paper out that is the first to really closely examine some of the key mechanisms by which these laws might affect crime. And there's a great deal of skepticism, and perhaps understandably, of why relaxing concealed carry laws might make a difference, given that those who obtain licenses, the little data that's available suggests that they are not particularly high-risk individuals as a group. But some of the key mechanisms identified in this paper that found these laws associated with a 29% increase in gun assaults and a 32% increase in gun robberies. This was a city-level study of cities with 250,000 population and more. But the key mediators that they found connected to these violence-generating effects were a large increase in gun theft and a reduction in police clearing violent crime, incidents of violent crime. Next slide. Now, as Cass alluded to in her opening comments, we at our center, we were particularly interested in some of the nuances within these broad categories. Some of the studies lump together very different kind of law changes, sometimes lumping together shall issue and permitless, but also even within the category of shall issue, some of the provisions within the general shall issue category could have meaningful impacts on what the effects of those changes in laws are. The ones that we zeroed in our study, two studies that I'll highlight, have to do with prohibitions for people with violent misdemeanor convictions, as well as prohibitions under somewhat not always well-defined categories of dangerousness or suitability. The other important thing, and again, Cass alluded to this, had to do with safety training requirements. What we zeroed in terms of what was available to sort of distinguish low bar from high bar is whether there was live fire safety training requirement in order to get a license. Next slide. So the first study I'm going to review was published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. And again, we were looking at this transition from may issue to shall issue, and whether there are differences within these different provisions or restrictions that go along with the shall issue conditions. Over the study period of 1980 to 2019, there were 36 changes from either no or may issue to shall issue. And the types of provisions that we were examining, there were changes depending on which category of shall issue provision. Anywhere from 12 to 27 states had these kind of changes. So a lot of change going on in this study period. We looked at rates of murder, aggravated assault, and robbery stratified by whether a gun was used or not. Set of controls were commonly used in other studies to explain variation over time and place in violent crime. The analytic method that we use as our primary method is augmented synthetic control with fixed effects. This is a methodology that's becoming more commonly used, and it recognizes that some states where the laws are not changing may be better matches to the places where the laws are changing in order to come up with true causal estimates in our analyses. Not going to go into too much detail about all the mechanics because I think this is a methodology becoming more common. We also use random effects meta-analysis to generate average treatment effects overall and then within the strata of interest. Next slide. I just want to give you an example. This is one state and one outcome. This is firearm murders, and these are what we call gap plots, and plots the difference between the state observed rates, Alabama's rates, versus its synthetic control. And we looked at 4 different types of model: augmented and regular synthetic control, with and without fixed effects. And we found that the models fit best for the augmented synthetic control with fixed effects. And you could see the closely around 0 before the law changed, and then the increase with a relatively tight precision after the law went into effect. Next slide. So if you average across all the different law changes from may to shall issue under these different categories of violent crimes, we find the only statistically significant effect is with assaults with guns. This translates into about a 9.5% increase in assaults with guns. The other categories were not statistically significant, but tended to be in the direction of more violence, not less. Next slide. Now we sort of break these things down. Here we're looking at effects of assaults and firearms, whether there's a violent misdemeanor in the first set, whether there's a violent misdemeanor prohibition present or absent. Here you see much greater, really the only significant effect is when there is no restrictions on violent misdemeanors for getting licenses to carry. We also see that we only see significant increases when there is no live fire provision in order to get a license. So this translates into a 23% increase in gun assaults when there are no violent misdemeanor prohibitions, and a 13% increase when there are no live fire training requirements. Next slide, please. To drill down a little bit more under this violent misdemeanor prohibition and its impact, we look here at homicides with firearms and by other means. And interestingly, and a little bit perplexingly, we see the clearest and the only statistically significant effect is with homicides by other means. Next slide, please. Looking here now at the presence of whether live fire training is required and its impacts on robberies, we see not quite statistically significant, but close to statistically significant increases when there's no live fire provision in order to get a shall issue issued under shall issue. And interestingly, we see a reduction in robberies with knives when violent misdemeanors are prohibited. Next slide. Generally, we found no differences across all the different categories when, as far as suitability and dangerousness prohibitions written into the law, sort of raising the question of whether these are actually used when decisions are made about whether to issue a license or not. Next slide. And then when we kind of, we looked at this in aggregate and looked at, in essence, how many restrictive provisions were part of a shall issue licensing law. And we see notable differences about whether there's at least some of these restrictive prohibitions or conditions or not. When here we're looking at firearm assaults and homicides with firearms. And you see a 22% increase in assaults with firearms and 30% increase in homicides with firearms when there's no restrictive prohibitions whatsoever in shall issue licensing. Next slide. I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to summarize this at the end, but there's connecting dots here between these two studies. This is the one published in Criminology and Public Policy, where we're looking at the transition from shall issue to permitless carry. Next slide, please. There's not a lot of prior research on permitless carry. Some of the studies published don't have any control groups or any. There was a really interesting, well-done paper presented at a national conference last year by Susan Parker using NIBRS data showing some significant increases in assaults with guns immediately following the adoption of permitless carry. In our study, we looked at 11 states that were adopting permitless carry. I think it's very noteworthy here in terms of understanding, sort of contextualizing the kind of changes that are going on, is that for 9 of the 11 states, they had shall issue licensing for 15 or more years. So in our thinking, these are states where it's been relatively easy to get a license to carry concealed if you want to do that prior to going permitless. Again, we look at similar outcomes of fatal and non-fatal crime with and without guns. We're also looking at negative controls with non-gun related events, and the same set of control variables basically that was used in the American Journal of Epidemiology study. Next slide. In this study, we use synthetic difference in difference methodology that calculates control unit weights parallel to the, so that basically it's addressing the need to have parallel trends in treated and untreated groups. And then we are looking at overall whether there's a difference in permitless going permitless after shall issue, and then zeroing in on changes relevant to our prior study of violent misdemeanor prohibitions and live fire, whether those provisions, those restrictive provisions, are being lost in this transition from shall issue to permitless. This approach is considered doubly robust because it's unbiased unless both the time and unit weights are incorrectly specified and the model is simultaneously misspecified. We use multiple robustness checks in this. I won't go through all of them. It's a very long article. I encourage those of interest to delve into it. But suffice to say, many different ways of looking at the data were examined to see whether our results remained robust. Next slide. So the key findings from this study is, first of all, if you look just in aggregate, we saw no statistically significant change in the violent crime categories of interest when moving from shall issue to permitless carry. However, when that change led to losing live fire safety training requirements, that was associated with a very large increase in assaults, a 32% increase in assaults with guns. There was also a 9.5% increase in knife-related assaults. However, our in-time placebo test suggests that the model for knife assaults is not really reliable. So sort of discount the that estimate of policy impact. We also found 8.5% but non-statistically significant increase in gun assaults when the transition to permitless meant losing a violent misdemeanor prohibition. We looked at 4 different types of secondary models. What I've shared with you now is sort of our primary modeling approach. Secondary models estimates were generally consistent with the primary model for the effects of losing live fire training and its impact on assaults with guns. And 2 of our approaches, our secondary measures methods, also found some evidence of increased robberies with guns when the violent misdemeanor prohibition was lost when going permitless. Next slide. I want to also just sort of briefly note another paper that looked at the effect of going permitless from shall issue, but with a different outcome. This was published in Journal of Urban Health using gun violence archive data that we've abstracted at our center. We used augmented synthetic control methods again, and the bottom line is we found permitless carry laws increased officer shootings of civilians by 12.9%. Next slide, please. So I think, and I think our team thinks that there's important policy implications in our current legal environment. First of all, licensing is important. There's a whole nother body of research on licensing for purchasers that also confirms that. Good reason to think that if you have been convicted, at least recently, of violent crimes You should be prohibited from carrying concealed loaded guns. And I think we should, as a field, be thinking about other ways to objectively identify people with violent histories, at least recently. For example, people with domestic violence restraining orders or ERPO-related restrictions, extreme risk protection order. Sorry, using too many acronyms. We find evidence that live fire safety training is protective. Cass mentioned that a lot of the safety training is pretty low bar minimum. So we would love to see more rigorous training and competency requirements built into licensing protocols. And if Cass is willing to, she could also talk a little bit about using virtual reality to try to, in that context of safety training. Last slide, please. I'll just end with one unexamined question that is very active in a policy conversation and in the courts right now, which is, what about this sensitive place restrictions on carried concealed guns? That's a understudied question. And it's quite possible that it could go either way. We don't know how many incidents of gun violence occur in these sensitive places, how many such incidents involve people with license or legal to carry guns in those spaces. And then what about the effects of gun thefts from motor vehicles? That's something that John Donahue and his co-authors examine. That could come into play here in a very complicated calculus of the ultimate effects of changes in gun policy for concealed carry. So that's what I have to share today, and I think Cass has some other information to share from public polling that we've done on these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So I wanted to share just a few thoughts on findings from our national public opinion polling survey that we do every other year. So most recently, this was fielded in January and February of 2023. And I wanted to share some of this data relevant to some of the points that Daniel had mentioned. So in the research Daniel was speaking about, there was the live fire training component. We don't ask that very specifically in the public opinion poll, but we do ask if people want to carry a loaded concealed handgun in public, should they be able to, or should they have to pass a test to demonstrate they can safely and lawfully use firearms in common ways they might encounter. And 73% of people overall say, yes, you should have to pass a test. And that includes 68% of gun owners. So really broad support for that policy piece, which may or may not include live fire training. With regard to permitless carry, only 23% of adults overall say they support allowing people to carry a loaded concealed gun in public without having to get a permit or a license. And that includes only 35% of gun owners. So a very large proportion of folks who own firearms also think it's probably not a great idea to allow people to carry concealed firearms in public. With regard to sensitive places, a lot of attention has been paid to college and K-12 school campuses. And I know that wasn't very directly spoken about in the research, but I do think it's worth noting that only about a quarter of US adults think it's a good idea to allow people to licensed people to carry firearms into these spaces, including, again, only about a third of gun owners. So broad support for passing a test demonstrating you can safely and lawfully use firearms, pretty low support across the board for expanding the ways that people can carry and where they can carry. So thanks for that presentation, Daniel. We've got some great questions in the chat. Louisa, do you want me to turn it back over to you for questions? Do you want me to kick them over? You're on mute. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. I'm happy to share moderating with you here, Cass. I think there's some great questions here. I do want to exercise a moderator's right of first question just because I have a burning one. This is not a plug for a Joyce-funded project, but I just read a great book called The Danger Imperative by a professor out of UT Austin, Michael Sierra Arevalo, that emphasizes the extent to which officer fear really inflects, police behavior, and how that intersects with a culture and a reality of a lot of guns. And I'm curious if Daniel, you spoke a little bit about the impact of some of these legislative shifts on officer involved shootings, and I'm curious if that any of that research speaks specifically to officer safety, or if that's a potential sort of avenue for future research in terms of understanding what the impact of some of these changes are. And also just noting sort of, it's been interesting to observe that in some of the public education and advocacy conversations around these shifts, it's been an interesting place where we've seen law enforcement and sort of more traditional gun violence prevention movement advocates sometimes sort of shoulder to shoulder and expressing some concern about the impact of these shifts towards more permissiveness. So I'm curious if there's research there, or if you think it's an interesting avenue for future study.
Yeah, well, it's certainly interesting for further study. Eager to read about the danger imperative. The summaries that I've read, I nod my head to quite a bit. And, there's a lot of data points that connect the dots, in essence, between what officers face when they are doing their jobs. And in some places, they encounter a lot more people with guns in very tense and risky scenarios than in other places. David Hemingway published a study some years ago showing that the strongest predictor across states in the number of fatal police shootings of civilians was the prevalence of gun ownership. The study that I highlighted here, I think, is consistent with that. And I'll also note that we have another study led by Cass, different set of data and different methodology, but also shows the same thing, that both transitions from may to shall issue and from shall issue to permitless are associated with higher risk for civilians being shot by police officers. And I'll, of course, note that at least in my following of some of the political debates around permitless carry, law enforcement was really arguing against these types of policies. So to me, it all seems quite logical, and there's a lot of things behind police shootings that we should be looking at. A lot of our focus has been on race, questions relevant to race, which are appropriate. I'll note that almost 2/3 of shootings by law enforcement involve the person shot has a firearm or a replica firearm. So clearly, part of the risk of these shootings has to do with the risk perceived by the officer. I'm not justifying anything. I'm just saying that that's sort of the actual context that's going on. And so the policies that impact availability of guns in the kind of risky situations that officers encounter, predictably, I think, are going to, translate into either more or less civilians shot.
Thanks so much. Cass, do you wanna choose a couple from the queue here? And thank you all. Keep the questions coming. If you like, we have some great ones in the Q&A here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were some that came in early that I think, Daniel, you addressed. But one thing that came up that is something that we have talked a lot about, and I'm sure there's a lot of interest in, sort of the question around dangerousness. So this was asked in the context of the Rahimi case and the oral arguments about sort of principles of dangerousness and restricting access there. But sort of what do we know about dangerousness? What do we know from the data?
Well, quite honestly, the only thing we know from the data is just like what's on the books. But honestly, I think some of the most important research that we need to do in the field of gun policy research is look at implementation and enforcement practices. Look to see if and how agencies that issue licenses actually use those type of prohibitions and on what basis do they use them. There's also some slight differences in language in the dangerousness provisions. Some have some degree of specificity with examples, some do not. So I think more work is needed there. And also I'll just say the reason I raised prior restraining orders and things like that is we want to move towards very objective means for assessing danger. And in the restraining order context, at least a court has examined what the situation is, as opposed to, a random officer at an agency that looks at some information and says, oh, I think he's dangerous, or I don't think he's dangerous. The examples I was raising at least went through a court context.
Yeah, I would just add to that, anytime we can rely on objective information rather than having a subjective decision being made, I think that will help with disparities, with application of the law, understanding of the
Absolutely.
law. Yeah, no, that's great, Daniel. Thank you. There are two sort of related questions that I'm gonna kind of mush together, which is there something about concealed carry laws that might influence the practice of concealed carry? There's a sort of a question very specifically, do we think that going to a permitless law, for example, might attract people who want to carry, sort of move into that state? Sort of what do we know about the policies and behaviors?
Well, again, I'll sound like a broken record, but we need to know more. We need more research in this area. But here's what I'll say is that there's a little bit of research on, as I alluded to before, that people who got licenses under a shall issue context, there's data from a couple of states that suggests that the people who go through the legal process to get licenses, generally have low rates of offending, lower than average rates of offending. And the great concern with moving from shall issue to permitless was that we know, actually some research that we've done, that just because you're not legally prohibited to purchase or possess a gun in your home doesn't mean that you don't have risk or that you actually haven't committed violent acts before. So the permitless opened up a much broader set of the population to legally carry than who was carrying under shall issue. So, but again, I think we need to examine that more and how those policies change. There's so many factors here. I think one has to do even with what are the penalties for not having a license under shall issue, and what's the probability, like how much are police focused on illegal carrying. So there's a lot of things that could change what concealed carry looks like in a given time and place.
Yeah, thanks for that, Daniel. And, really thinking about how we can understand these norms, behaviors, sort of is policy driving norms or norms driving policy, right? That's an important thing to be thinking about. And so I'm trying to find the one that I just had here. I was scrolling through the questions. So thinking about the training piece. So there are a couple of questions related to training. One was sort of specifically thinking about what about live fire training might make a difference, but there was also a question, and again, we think about this all the time, about sort of access to
Sure.
safety training that includes live fire, how that might disproportionately impact communities that have limited access or resources. So can you talk a little bit about what
Yeah,
might work about live fire training and how we're trying to think about broader access?
sure. Well, there's multiple ways that live fire training could translate into safer concealed carry. One, quite frankly, is fewer people decide to get a license and fewer people are carrying guns, and fewer people carrying guns means, I think, often fewer people getting shot or shooting, fewer guns stolen. So I do think we have to recognize that, particularly under current conditions, that this is a cost and an inconvenience, and so fewer people are going to do it, and that may be the most important distinction, really. The other thing is, people who are most safety conscious will be the ones who will say, "Yes, I want to go through safety training. I'm fine with that." And if you're not so much about this, maybe you're not really the right person to carry a concealed gun safely. So there's sort of what we might think of as selection issues, selection effects. But circling back to the first part, which is basically you're making things more costly and more inconvenient, and not surprisingly, that will affect probably people living in cities, particularly places with not good transportation. I think there are far more opportunities and places where you can do this outside of cities than inside of cities. So I think this requirement probably shapes why you'll probably see more concealed carry license issued in suburban and rural places than in urban settings. Um, I raised the issue of a different way to do live fire that's probably even better than what's been done now. Is actually, good quality virtual reality kind of simulation. And Cass, I don't know if you want to, it's sort of a opening for you to say something about that.
Sure, yeah. So we've been working for a couple of years now with our applied physics lab to develop a virtual reality system that can test the appropriateness and accuracy of gun use in sort of common situations folks might encounter, partly driven from what we were seeing in public opinion polling, that people generally think it's a good idea to do the test, but how do you do it? Particularly when you may have limited access to the physical spaces or just access to training. And so we're at the stage we are set to start doing pilot data collection in the next couple of weeks. We're really excited. And we'll be able to see how people are interacting in various situations that they've been randomized to. What are they looking at? When do they reach for their firearm? If they decide to use their firearm, did they hit what they're aiming at or not? Which is important. Again, I mentioned at the beginning that I have been through some training courses for concealed carry and other training courses. And often the vibe in those courses is like, you take this course, you walk out of here, you're like Jack Reacher or some other sort of superhero-esque special agent who's going to be able to do all sorts of great things. But often that very same course, if you have people even stand at the firing range and shoot at a non-moving paper target, people don't have great aim. And so the expectation that they can translate those actions and appropriate use out into sort of real situations they might engage with is suspect, perhaps, maybe not for everybody, but certainly for some folks. And so we're really hopeful that we'll be able to develop the system, proof of concept, and have people potentially use this as a way to assess readiness or sort of check themselves to see how they might actually perform in some of these circumstances.
I'm really excited to see this. I think that's the future right there, honestly. We've been living in a fantasy world where a lot of people think this is really easy to use a gun in self-defense. And the truth is very much not that. Yeah, great.
So a question related to sort of interaction between concealed carry and other policies. So there's a question about in Delaware, they just finally passed permit to purchase, but there's some concern that maybe folks would repeal concealed carry licensing then because permit to purchase is in place. So one, can you just sort of explain the quick difference between those two policies and why they're both still important? What are some pitfalls that folks should look out for?
Yeah, so obviously the license is for two different things. One is just to purchase a firearm. One is to carry concealed in public places. In my opinion, I actually think that we should be talking more about the connections between these two general ideas. Because as you've alluded to, our polls show that there's very broad support for licensing for concealed carry. There's also very broad support for licensing just to purchase a handgun. And purchaser licensing, we found very, very strong effects on virtually every form of gun violence that we've studied, including officer-involved shootings. And so a lot of sort of the mystery and angst around purchaser licensing, I think you can look to the experience with concealed carry licensing to show that, yeah, law enforcement has the capacity to screen people to do this. And obviously, I think there's efficiencies in some respects because you have the same sort of apparatus to do a licensing process. So, and in some places, at least being considered, is that if you already have a concealed carry license, you don't have to get a purchaser license. So I of course, believe that licensing should be our norm, that it's effective. There's nothing the Supreme Court thus far has said that says that licensing in and of itself violates the Second Amendment. There's an interesting, important case now looking at Maryland's handgun purchaser licensing that's going to be heard very soon in Richmond that we're in pins and needles about. But generally speaking, again, when you put the different pieces together, we have empirical support about protective effects on public safety. We have very strong popular support, and generally been on pretty firm legal grounds for this. So
that's great, thank you. So there's a question about sort of analysis that looked at raw data, that looked at permitless carry law changes, and saw about a 22% increase in gun homicide in the couple of years after passage compared to 10% nationally. And so this, again, was just looking at raw CDC data. And the question is sort of what kinds of things lead to an increase in the raw data that doesn't show up once the controls are added. So more of a research methods question.
Yeah, so look, there's a lot that goes into generating these estimates. We're not looking at 1 year to the next. We're not looking at one state by itself or even a country by itself. It's a very systematic approach to looking at lots of trend data, comparative analysis, and again, focusing on the most legitimate types of comparisons. And, we think that the synthetic control approach often gets you there. So I just think a lot of times people find a couple of data points and either they confirm or don't confirm someone's pre-existing thought. And I think you just sort of have to take a deep breath and say it's far more complicated and turn to our research.
That's great. So there's a question about the sort of in the post-Bruen world, what kinds of permitting or licensing is still possible? And you touched on this a little bit, but the question very specifically about the the two pieces that we were looking at, prohibiting certain kinds of people and requiring live fire training, there's nothing that prevents states from taking those actions in the current Bruin context, right?
As far as I know, Kelly Roskin from our team at the Center for Gun Violence Solution is cataloging this along a lot of other people. There's so much litigation going on right now, it's hard to keep track of it. But I've not seen anything where courts have said the kind of provisions that we're talking about that we found to be protective violate the Second Amendment using those provisions. The idea of restricting firearm access to someone with a history of violence is pretty firmly, on pretty firm ground of the Second Amendment. And I'm talking now about the violent misdemeanor restrictions. So again, things can change, but right now, I think these are safe from a legal perspective as well as effective.
Can you talk at all, Daniel, about what we know about the effects of loosening concealed carry laws on unintentional shootings, either fatal or non-fatal?
It is something that our group has not examined, and quite honestly, I'm not sure I know of a study that have examined that. Cass, do you know of a study that? So
I'm not aware of any, no.
yeah, I do think it's worth studying for sure. I know that just in just news accounts, there has been increases in unintentional shootings of late, particularly among young children, and I just think we live in a world now in so many places where concealed carry has become more normative. And it used to be that the whole conversation about keeping guns safe so that children or teens don't get unsupervised access to firearms principally was a conversation about storage of firearms within your home. But if you carry guns on a regular basis in a variety of different contexts, you may leave your gun any number of places. It could be in your car. I've read incidents of teachers leaving their guns in the school bathroom. There's all kinds of places where there's just going to be more guns available. And, all the research on unintentional shootings connects perhaps what the obvious is, which is exposure to firearms means more unintentional shootings. So I think I have a working hypothesis of what we might find, but I don't think there's any research yet.
I'm gonna exercise my prerogative again and get the last question. First question and last question. That's how I go. So Andy raised a question in the chat that really resonated with me as someone who claims absolutely no background research, which was, do you all have thoughts, and perhaps here you're both putting on your Center for Gun Violence Solutions hats, which if folks don't know, sort of straddles the research and also sort of policy and practice. Do you all have thoughts or recommendations on how folks who are more squarely on the advocacy side can present these data in ways that are sort of quickly digestible to both the public and policymakers, knowing that as researchers, right, you're cautious in stating how definitive some of these are. Are there places that you can point folks or resources that we could include in our, in our follow-up email to everyone who registered here that they might find useful?
I'm going to let Cass tackle that one.
Yeah, so we have a few things on our center website, so I can share links with you, Louisa, that we can make sure that goes out with this. I would say, for the most part, the folks making decisions about these policies are probably going to fall asleep if we jumped into like a deep dive on the weeds of all the analytics. So when we're talking with policymakers, we generally try to focus on the fact that we use data to come up with the best comparison that we could find, regardless of the method that we're using, so that when we compared what happened in the states or state that changed its law and those that didn't, we have a good comparison. And then once we've we have that good comparison, then we found X, Y, or Z things happened. So increases in harm, or if we pass, a protective law, reductions in an outcome, and really trying to keep it simple, not because people are too dumb to understand, but also, like you said, they just don't have the attention sometimes to really engage in that. Daniel, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that's good. I think the general idea is get the bottom line summary and underscore that this is scientifically peer-reviewed research. And perhaps
Yep.
that's enough.
Spoken like a true scientist. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I regret, as always, that we didn't get to every question, but we are really glad that you joined us to talk about this topic, and we're grateful to you both, Daniel and Cass, for your time today. This webinar will be made available on the Joyce Foundation website in the coming days, along with information about our next Lunch and Learn webinar. We'll also include a copy of the slides and any supplemental materials that the presenters want to share, and you'll all get that in your email in the next little bit. So thank you all again so much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.